Well, hello, good morning. Thank you all for joining this book launch of my new book, A Physician in the Age of Liberal Reform, Ildefonso Martínez y Fernández and Medical Politics in 19th Century Spain. There's a copy of the book, and I'm very grateful to the designers at LSU Press. They've got a nice 19th century newspaper vibe here in the fonts. And as we'll see, a lot of the source materials for the book come from periodical literature from that period. Let me just begin by saying, in such a condensed presentation, I'll inevitably oversimplify and probably elide certain connections that are spelled out more clearly in the book. So please don't hesitate to ask any questions that you may have during the Q&A at the end. I'd like to begin with just an account of how this project came about. It was actually due to a series of rather interesting coincidences. I had no idea that I would write a book on the 19th century. I'm an early modernist, actually, by training. And my previous book dealt with 16th and 17th century Inquisition trials for the crime of feigned sanctity. And these were trials for spiritual persons who claimed to have had divine raptures and revelations, and then were hauled before Inquisition tribunals to see if they were legit. And so, yeah, quite a different purview than the present work. And this all began with an email that I got sort of out of the blue in 2016. Part of my previous work had dealt with medicine and the Inquisition, and a colleague was putting together a collection on that topic. But by that time, I had moved on to other things and really didn't feel like I had anything new to say on the subject. But I wanted to be polite, and so I said, I have a research trip to Spain on the horizon, and so I'll see if I can find something that might be useful. And so there I was in the National Library in Madrid, and I summoned up all my cutting-edge research skills, and I entered into the catalog medicine and Inquisition. That was my strategy. And as fate would have it, the first document to come up on the screen was a 19th century document called Physicians Persecuted by the Spanish Inquisition. Again, my experience as a historian of the Inquisition had been centuries before this, but I was intrigued, and the document ended up being by one Ildefonso Martínez y Fernández. And then in another fortuitous coincidence, it turned out that his collected papers had just been cataloged across town at the historical library of the Complutense University. So I ran across town and requested these collected papers, and they brought them out and plopped them down on the table. And after just a few minutes of kind of thumbing through them, I was immediately fascinated and thought, here's a book. And so it turns out, again, in another interesting coincidence, that Ildefonso Martínez had actually reissued a number of early modern works that I had dealt with in my previous work. So there was a connection there, and I'll detail that as we get further in here. And so Ildefonso Martínez, as it turned out, was a physician who died of cholera. He died in a pandemic in the wake of a political insurrection. Now, in the summer of 2016, pandemics and political insurrections seemed like scourges that conveniently afflicted other times and places. Of course, that changed quite dramatically over the course of researching and writing this book. And of course, in 2020, we found ourselves in the midst of a global pandemic. And it was a little bit uncanny writing the history of a character who had died in a pandemic. I had to put some of my research trips on hold because international travel was difficult during that time, if not impossible. But I did get back to Spain in the summer of 2022 to kind of finish up, tie up some loose ends with the research. And I was determined to visit the city where Ildefonso Martínez died. And this was in Oviedo in the north of Spain. And so I took the train up to Oviedo and searched out a street that was named in his honor, and spent several days in the archives reading accounts of the cholera epidemic, and then returned to Madrid, and the next day tested positive for COVID. So this was having never gotten COVID until I went to the city where the subject of my biography died of an infectious disease. So that was just kind of one final bizarre coincidence involved with the research and writing of this book. So let me begin to get into some of the themes that I deal with in the book by talking about revolutionizing la medicina patria. And this was actually the provisional title of the book for most of the time that I was writing. I want to thank James Long with LSU for suggesting the current title, which I think is an improvement. The phrase revolutionizing la medicina patria now has become the subtitle for the introduction of the book. But it does encompass kind of the main theme of the work. And when I speak of revolutionizing, the revolution that I'm referring to is the liberal revolution in Spain that dismantled the old regime in the wake of the Napoleonic invasion of 1808 and the Spanish War of Independence that sought to expel the French forces thereafter. During this time, Spain was in chaos, but out of that chaos came important liberal reforms, the drafting of a constitution in 1812, which was actually one of Europe's most liberal constitutions at that time. Napoleon sent his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, to take the throne in Spain, but he was opposed in a popular uprising, and the Spanish monarch, Fernando VII, was reinstated. So this book takes place during the liberal revolution, which sought to create a new liberal regime to take the place of the old regime that had collapsed after the Napoleonic invasion. And physicians played important roles as political actors and as public intellectuals during this period. And so la medicina patria is a phrase that was seemingly on every physician's tongue during these years. And it could be translated simply as medicine of the motherland or national medicine, but it really takes on a connotation of a kind of patriotic medicine. And indeed, medicine and medical discourse were crucial in this process of creating a new liberal political culture for Spain in the middle decades of the 19th century. And so in a very broad sense, that's the theme of the book. So why Martinez? Why did he represent such an interesting case study in revolutionizing La Medicina Patria? Well, for one thing, his life maps onto important developments in the liberal revolution. He was born fittingly in 1821, which was in the midst of what was known as the Liberal Triennial. And this was a military uprising that sought to depose Fernando VII with his absolutist aspirations and installed a new liberal regime, which reinstated the Constitution of 1812, which had been abrogated. And it also resulted in the main split in the forces of liberalism into kind of what were called moderados and progresistas, moderates and progressives. The moderates were constitutional monarchs who wanted to protect business interests and property and slow the pace of the revolution, while the progressives, on the other hand, tended to be younger, more radical political activists who wanted to broaden the franchise and increase the democratic nature of this new liberal regime. Like many of these liberal interludes, the triennial, as its name suggests, was short-lived. It was just 3 years, and after which Fernando reassumes the throne and inaugurates what is known as the ominous decade. And this was a period in which absolutism was reinforced, and political liberties were curtailed. Many liberal activists were forced into exile. And it was also a period of retrenchment in Spanish science and medicine. A draconian censorship was imposed on scientific publications. And in 1824, the government implemented a medical curriculum that designated Latin as the official academic language, mandated the study of the Catholic religion for all students, and recommended a 16th century commentary on the text of Hippocrates for use in clinical education. So needless to say, these were not sort of cutting edge reforms for medical education at the time. So the life of Ildefonso Martínez maps nicely onto this key moment in the liberal revolution. And he begins his professional career during what was known as the moderate decade that came after the ominous decade. And this was a new sort of renaissance of the liberal project after the death of Fernando and the ascension of Isabel II to the throne. And it marked a regeneration of the medical profession, profusion of new medical and scientific associations, and a proliferation of medical periodicals. So Ildefonso Martínez begins his professional career at this auspicious moment, and he throws himself into this new medical political milieu. He founded a number of medical periodicals, including The Truth, Journal of Medicine and the Auxiliary Sciences, and another paper entitled The Crucible. Both of these were rather short-lived publications in which Martínez held forth on the medical and political issues of the day. And he also founded a number of professional associations, medical clubs, the Medical Surgical Society for Emulation and Reciprocal Instruction, the Medico-Surgical Athenaeum of Madrid, the Academia of Asclepius, and the Medical Institute for Emulation. So he was an important but overlooked figure in this medical renaissance of the 1840s. And the voluminous literary output that's included in his periodicals and the collected papers, his collected papers include many of the speeches and discourses that were presented at these various professional associations. And these are what form the documentary basis of the book. Now, one address that immediately caught my eye as I began thumbing through his papers was one that he gave to the Medico-Surgical Athenaeum entitled "The Influence of the Physical on the Moral and Vice Versa." And this brings me to the theme of medical politics, which of course is in the subtitle of the book, Ildefonso Martínez and Medical Politics in 19th Century Spain. So what do I mean by medical politics? It's more than the fact that physicians were active in liberal politics. I mean, indeed, many physicians served in the legislature and had active roles in the public sphere, but the relationship between medicine and politics in 19th century Spain was not limited to the efforts of professionals to navigate the new political realities of this emerging liberal regime. Beginning in the late 18th century, there was the rise of an anthropological notion of medicine as an all-encompassing science of man. I'll put that in quotation marks. That's the theme that comes up again and again, this idea of a science of man that would govern the health not only of individual bodies, but of the body politic as well. And this was an expansive conception of medicine's social role, and it was common throughout Europe. It emerged in the vitalist theorizing of the Montpellier School in France. For example, in the work of Paul-Joseph Barthes, he wrote a 1778 treatise entitled New Elements of the Science of Man. But the science of man really came into its own, and it tends to be associated with the French Revolutionary period, and above all in the work of Pierre-Jean-Georges Cavani. And he wrote a famous treatise entitled On the Relations Between the Physical and the Moral Aspects of Man. And this is where Ildefonso Martínez derived the phrase for his dissertation that he delivered to this professional organization. So having tracked down where Ildefonso Martínez developed his interest in the influence of the physical on the moral, I proceeded to immerse myself in the literature on the science of man, and in short order, I came across a book entitled The Physical and the Moral, Anthropology, Physiology, and Philosophical Medicine in France, 1715 to 1850, by a historian by the name of Elizabeth Williams. And she was and is the foremost authority on the science of man in the French context. And I reached out to her, and she was incredibly generous with her time and expertise, and was a huge help in the research for this book. And as a result of the influence of Cavani on the science of man, the science of man had typically been associated with a materialist left-wing perspective. For Cavani, the science of man was instrumental to the preservation of the French Republic in the sense that it served to educate loyal citizens who would be guided by the general will rather than the dictates of the Catholic Church. But as Elizabeth Williams has cautioned, it's possible to overemphasize the personality of Cavani, and this can result in a distorted view that reduces the medical science of man to a univocal ideological register, as she puts it, and it tends to lose track of the discourse in the years after the Revolution. And so Williams reminds us that the science of man was, quote, a protean, often fragmentary discourse that persisted long after the Revolution. And I'll just quote her again, because I think this really gets to the core of what I'm trying to do in my book. The neglect of the medical science of man of the early to mid 19th century has stemmed from two interrelated historiographical tendencies. One, to emphasize the development of forward-looking and progressive rather than traditional or archaic strains of French culture. And two, to reproduce and valorize ideological antinomies rather than to explore processes of adaptation, accommodation, and co-optation. So it was really these processes of adaptation, accommodation, and co-optation of the science of man that I deal with in my book. And I make a case that Ildefonso Martínez y Fernández was a key figure in this process of adaptation and co-optation of the science of man into the Spanish context. And especially when it comes to co-optation, I show how Ildefonso Martínez marshaled an early modern medical politics. And as I mentioned at the outset, this was one that I had actually dealt with in my previous book. And he sought to co-opt the French science of man in support of a narrative of Spanish medicine, and the idea that Spain had pioneered a unique medical political tradition in early modern Spain, and that this early modern political discourse had anticipated the science of man. So it was a science of man avant la lettre. And two of the crowning glories of this tradition in Spain were La Nueva Filosofía de la Naturaleza del Hombre, the New Philosophy of Human Nature by Oliva Sabuco, and El Examen de Ingenios, an examine of men's wits by Huarte de San Juan. And both of these treatises sought to naturalize human cognition to account for psychological differences and differences in aptitudes in purely physiological terms. The idea here and the political ramifications of this medical political project were that princes could more effectively marshal the talents and capabilities of their subjects if they could identify their innate abilities and how they might best serve the state. So not only did Martínez produce new editions of both of these works, he commented extensively on them in annotations to the texts themselves and in articles that he published in the medical press and in presentations given to professional societies. And what's so remarkable, and I think what constitutes the historiographic gap that this book is attempting to fill, is that the secondary literature on Sabuco and Huarte is just enormous, but there's been absolutely nothing written on their influence in the 19th century. And Ildefonso Martínez was the chief expositor of these early modern medical political thinkers. And so in the book, I deal with many examples where Martínez co-opts the science of man from its French form into a liberal narrative that helped to create a new political culture for liberal Spain. I'll just kind of circle back to this initial document that I found, Physicians Persecuted by the Inquisition. This is another interesting example of Martínez mobilizing the history of early modern Spain in the context of creating a new political culture. And in this treatise, he characterizes physicians as martyrs to the cause of progressive politics and the advancement of scientists that was thwarted by the old regime, epitomized by this the Spanish Inquisition. Now, interestingly, while Martínez holds up physicians as victims of the Inquisition, as I detail in my previous book, the fact of the matter was that physicians were as likely to have collaborated with the Inquisition than to have actually been victimized. Well, undoubtedly, they were victims, but they were hired by the Inquisition to oversee torture sessions and to treat patients in inquisitional prisons. So again, as often happens in the creation of these new political cultures, it's a kind of selective appropriation of the past. And but it also shows Martínez's fascination with this idea of martyrdom, and this runs throughout his entire opus. And in another kind of bizarre coincidence, after an entire career of focusing on martyrdom, we can, I think, safely say that Martínez died martyr's death, a heroic death in voluntarily going to the city of Oviedo to treat cholera victims at the age of 34, where he contracted cholera and died an early death. And again, while martyrdom was kind of a political trope for Martinez, I don't discount the sacrifice that he made. And in fact, as I mentioned at the outset, I was writing a lot of this book during the COVID pandemic. In fact, and reading accounts of healthcare professionals putting their lives at risk during the COVID pandemic. In fact, the book is dedicated to these healthcare professionals and also to my mother who died with COVID in 2020. So to sum up, the book touches on many other themes that I've been unable to touch on in this kind of short overview. But again, I hope that these lacunae will provide motivation to read the actual book, which I should say you can get at a 40% off discount as a token of appreciation for attending this book launch. And I'll also say, while I've kind of done a very rapid overview and touched on some overarching themes of the book, in writing the book, I took great pains to provide a lot of detail and try to present a nuanced portrait of an individual life, and that only comes out from an actual reading of the book. And I've attempted to use this life of Ildefonso Martínez y Fernández as a way of highlighting the ambiguities and complexities of mid-19th century Spain. The historiography of 19th century Spain has often been prone to stark polarities and sweeping generalizations. And it's my hope that this study can contribute to a renewed appreciation of the intricacies and subtleties of the era. So thank you so much for your attention and your attendance. And at this point, we're glad to open it up to any questions that folks might have.
Thank you so much. Our first question is about what you mentioned on the fact that the subject founded different publications and associations. Do any of those still exist to this day?
No, as I mentioned, most of them were remarkably short-lived. This is a very turbulent period, and I mean they're still available, and thankfully many of them have actually been digitized, and but as none of the ones that I use in the book are still being published today.
Thank you. Our next question is about your expectations entering into the research process. So can you talk a bit about elements of your findings that surprised you or subverted your expectations versus those that maybe reinforced some of the expectations you had going in?
Yes, absolutely. That's a great question. And as I mentioned in my closing, the history of 19th century Spain, it's just prone to stark dichotomies. And what was so fascinating to me about the life of Martinez was that he just confounds a host of these sorts of dichotomies. So for example, in his writings on the mind-body problem, there's a whole chapter on that in the book. Typically we have a division, but sort of an ideological division when it comes to sort of spiritualism versus materialism. You get the more conservative factions insisting on a spiritualized notion of an immaterial, immortal soul, and then the more radical factions trying to naturalize the human cognition and look at sort of localized functions in the brain. But Martinez one of the most interesting things, because he was certainly a man of the left, but he uses these early modern medico-political treatises to try to find a middle way, what he called an enlightened eclecticism between these poles of spiritualism and materialism. And it was a fascinating, again, I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but there's a whole chapter on it. But that's just one example of where he really confounded expectations. He was a radical leftist, but he was not, he was anti-clerical, but not a-religious. And he takes great pains in his work to try to reconcile his positions with not necessarily the Catholic Church, but with religion, construed more generally. So I really found him to be, at every turn, he confounded my sort of pre-existing expectations about where we would come down on a host of issues.
Thank you. Our next question, you mentioned that you actually visited some of these places in person, and that some of this was affected by the COVID pandemic. But aside from that experience, can you talk more about how physically being in some of these spaces impacted your research? So much research now is happening, virtually only. So how would actually being in these spaces change the trajectory of your work or the tone of your work?
That's another really interesting question. And I struggle with this a lot. I mean, I've never written a biography before. Again, I had no intention to do so. There's a great piece. I'm trying to remember the author, but it's called "Historians Who Love Too Much," and it's about biographers and the kind of identification that often develops and with your subject of your research. And it was I was quite drawn to Oviedo and this idea of visiting these spaces that he had occupied. I mentioned that I had gone to the street that was named after him, and it was actually kind of a rundown, graffiti-strewn alleyway. But I walked down to the end of it, and I found the sign that dedicating the street to him, and underneath it was a bouquet of flowers. And I was so blown away by this. I thought this was this obscure figure, but there was a neighborhood organization who had made the connection between his sacrifice during the cholera epidemic and the COVID-19 pandemic. So yeah, it's a struggle, I think, that presents itself for biographers. I mean, there were many, in some senses, he was very heroic. There were many sort of unsavory aspects about him that I deal with in the book. I mean, as so many 19th century intellectuals, I mean, he had racist and sexist views that come out. The science. There's a section in the book called, for example, "The Science of Man" and "Men of Science." I mean, the science of man in general was, had very stark, positive, very stark differences between sexes. And but yeah, it was different for me than my previous research. Certainly, I'd go on certain streets in Madrid, places where he had spoken, and it had a certain resonance for me that was different from my previous work.
Thank you. Our next question here is about sort of the role of physicians within society at this time. How would contemporary readers maybe be surprised by or be interested in or be unfamiliar with some of the roles maybe that the subject of this biography took on that we might not associate with physicians in today's society and culture?
Yeah, I mean, I came to this as an early modernist, and so I was quite amazed. I mean, when I go for my yearly checkup with my physician, I don't have any expectation that he's going to, inquire about the state of my soul, right? I mean, or present himself as a kind of political visionary. But the purview of medicine was just remarkably broad in the 19th century, and this was a real revelation to me. And so they really saw a a connection between individual bodies and the body politic. They saw themselves as, and again, this goes back to the early modern period, the medical humanism that I deal with in my first book. Physicians had a much broader array of responsibilities and cultural roles. And so, yeah, I find that it's just quite a different cultural milieu.
Thank you. Our next question is about future projects. Do you have a future projects on the horizon that you're working on? Are they similar, different to this one? You know, what's next?
Well, yeah, there actually might be some method to this madness. I've already several times mentioned that this project really came out of the blue. But when I think back about these two books that I've done, and looking forward to this third book, which I hope to be the final installment of an unintentional trilogy. It deals with mysticism in late 19th and early 20th century Spain. And of course, mysticism was a big theme in the first book because it was about the trials of spiritual imposters. Many of them modeled themselves on Saint Teresa of Avila and other famous Spanish mystics. So the provisional title for the next book is Saint Teresa of Avila, Henri Bergson, and the Making of Mystical Modernism. So I guess, you know, the theme that runs through these three works is kind of mysticism, medicine, and modernity. I want to look at, well, I got the idea from a trip to Avila, Saint Teresa's home city. And if you ever visit there, you know, it's a famous walled city. The medieval walls are still there, and they're just breathtaking, beautiful. And you can go and visit the home of Saint Teresa of Avila, and you walk by statues of other famous mystics, Saint John of the Cross. But then when you pass through one of the gates in these old medieval ramparts, you come across the International Center for the Study of Mysticism. And I was so struck by this because the mysticism that they present at the International Center for the Study of Mysticism is nothing like the mysticism of Saint Teresa, really. You know, it's a modernized version of a kind of perennial philosophy, to borrow the phrase from Aldous Huxley, this idea that all religions share this basic underlying, you know, mystical unity. So when making that trip, I had the question became sort of, how did mysticism get from one side of the wall to the other? Or in other words, how did mysticism go from being religious knowledge to esoteric knowledge, which is, I would argue, what it is today. And so the making of mystical modernism is taking its cue from the title of a book by David McMahon called The Making of Buddhist Modernism. And it's a fascinating book. He talks about how Buddhism, as it came to the West, you know, was completely reconfigured into a kind of modernist form that was compatible with, you know, scientific rationality. And it wasn't the case that Westerners just went to the East and kind of cherry picked what they wanted. It was a concerted effort on the part of Asian Buddhists to repackage Buddhism in a way that was more palatable to the West. And so my thesis is that a similar thing happened in Spain, but we don't typically read about this. When we look at mysticism, we think of people like Henri Bergson, and William James and Aldous Huxley, who kind of went in and cherry-picked St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa and brought them into the modern world. But I'm looking at Spaniards and their role in kind of presenting this new modernized vision of mysticism, people like Miguel de Unamuno, for example. So Yeah, I think that when it's all said and done, there'll be some uh, through lines in these three works, questions about the relationship between religion and science, between mind and body. So yeah, that's the idea. We'll see where it ends up.
Excellent. Well, that is our last question. So we can go ahead and say thank you and goodbye to the audience.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.